Check. It's a critical time in a chess game. And I always tell my students that when your opponent puts you in check, you should put your hands together and kind of pray for a good move. But you're not really praying, you're thinking and taking your time. And this keeps you from grabbing your king very quickly and moving it, because that should not be your first instinct. When your opponent puts you in check, there's 3 different ways to get out of it. You could capture the piece putting you in check. That should always be your number 1 option to look at. You could block the check. And finally, if you have to, then you could move the king, which could be your best move. The hard part is making the decision on which one to do. So we're going to look at how to make that decision of how to get out of check. Let's move to the chessboard. All right, I like to show my students a game I played against my friend Charlie Checks a Lot. Now, Charlie has this weird little affliction that once he starts checking you, he can't stop. And here we are, I'm white in this position, and Charlie is going to start out by using his rook to take my rook and put my king in check. So he captures here, check. First thing I'm going to do is look for a way to capture him, and my bishop can capture him. Crunch. Now his knight jumps in for a check. Well, I can capture that one too. Pawn takes. Here comes his bishop, capturing my pawn for check. Oh good, my rook's there. Crunch. His knight jumps into this other square for check. Well, I have another pawn. Crunch. The queen plays to check. This one's a little tricky. My knight has to move backwards. I can do that. And finally, Charlie played rook e8. He just couldn't resist. He loves to check. And of course, I played queen captures rook for a back ring checkmate. Now, in another game I played with Charlie, we played a whole match. Well, 3 games. In this game, Charlie plays bishop to b4 check. And I can't capture him, but I can block it. So then he plays another check. Queen to h4 check. I block that one with a pawn. When his rook checks me here, I have a couple different ways to block. I could block with the bishop at e4 or e2, but I want to move it to where it's protected. At e4, he could just capture it. So I come back this way and block the check. Now he gets back to his capturing for checks. Check. I captured his bishop. Check. There goes his queen. And check. And of course I captured his rook. But we weren't done. Now we played a game in which he starts checking me and my king is on the run. I only have 1 safe square for my king. I run down this way. But now it looks like there's no empty squares for my king to run to. And it's correct. There's no empty squares. But when you're in check, you can also move onto a square where one of your opponent's pieces is and just capture it, as long as it's not protected. So I took here, he checks me, I go running out this way, another check, just 1 square, check, my king continues to run, check, and now Charlie says checkmate. He forgot my king can take his pawn, and he tried it again, checkmate, but there's nothing guarding his queen, and there she goes. All right, those are my 3 games against Charlie Checks a Lot. But let's have a look at what happens when we have a choice. So here in this position, the black rook has captured a pawn, putting my king in check. And I have 3 ways to get out of it. I should always look at capturing first, then consider blocking, and then finally moving the king to a safe square. If you capture with the queen, then you're giving up a queen for a rook. Rooks are worth 5, queens are 9. So let's see if we can find something better. Moving the king over to the A file allows black to play a rook roller checkmate. Yikes. So guess what? Correct answer is to block in this case. Now in this position, this is a little tougher because the bishop's checking the king. He can't come over to the G file because of the rook back here. And so the choices are to capture with the rook, to block with the pawn, or to move the king up. And if you look carefully, you might think, oh, I don't want to capture with the rook. It's worth 5. And the bishop's just worth 3. He'll capture my rook back. But blocking's no good. They can just take it and leave you in the same situation. And if you move your king up, whether it's now or after they capture the blocking pawn, this move, bishop to f4, is checkmate. So in this case, your best option is just to capture the bishop right away and give that rook away. In this instance, we have a lot of different ways to block this check. And you certainly don't want to give away a higher value piece. So don't give away the queen. You don't want to bring your knight back because it's already on a good square. But some other choices you have are to push the pawn to block it, to offer a bishop trade when you block it, and to bring your knight from the side of the board back to block the check. I wouldn't advise moving the king because remember, then you can't castle. Now in this case, we see this bishop that's protected by the knight putting us in check. Don't capture it with your queen. You'll lose your queen for only a bishop. So the choice becomes, do we move the king or block it with one of our knights? The knight could go to either of these two squares, and the other knight could go into c3, or you could move the king. Once again, don't move the king, because then you can't castle. And the knight on e2 is already in the action. So we're going to use this knight, but which square is best? And we realize if you go to d2, the bishop will take you. It's an equal trade, but now you can't castle. So your best choice is knight to c3. Now when they take your knight, you'll be able to capture back with your queen, pawn, or your knight. Our final concept is very important. It's making sure that when your king runs away from a check, that you're not walking into a checkmate. So here in this position, the c-pawn is checking our king, and we have two choices. We can move forward into e5 or backwards to e3. Now if we move into e5 without considering our opponent's possible checks, black has two checks. This one's pretty harmless. Our king can run away to f4. But if our opponent plays knight g6, it's checkmate. Not only checking the king, but guarding our escape square. So for that reason, the best move would be king to e3. In this next position, our final one, the king has two choices of how to escape the check from the queen. The queen is protected by the rook, so you can't capture her, but you could either go backwards or forwards. And usually we think of going forwards as being dangerous, but here going backwards traps your king. He's stuck on the back, so king f1, it's an in-your-ear checkmate, guarded by the rook. So our best move is to escape at g3. All right, that is escaping check, and I'll check you later.